Ashes is such a great book to look at if you have confusion about tense, because Frank McCourt does this really interesting and somewhat unusual thing, which is that he switches tenses throughout the book. I do want to say something about consistency, because if you start a scene in a particular tense, you want to stay in that tense. What is maddening and feels out of control for your reader is when you are just changing tenses willy-nilly without paying attention or without realizing what you're doing or without being in control of what you're doing. But if you are in control and you're making intentional choices, then you can have some fluidity with tense choices. So let's look at Angela's Ashes, and I'm going to say some more words. Obviously, this is page 41. So for those of you who haven't read the book, you should, because it's amazing. It's incredibly poetic and beautiful. It's a coming of age narrative. And so here Frank McCourt is in the present tense. Most of the day, ma'am lies in bed with her face to the wall. If she drinks tea or eats anything, she throws up in the bucket under the bed, and I have to empty it and rinse it in the lavatory down the hall. Mrs. Leibovitz brings her soup and funny bread that is twisted, right? So we're looking at the verbs. They're clearly all in the present tense. And the thing about the present tense is that visceral sense, right? I mean, we're in the character's immediate experience. And I think one of the things that happens a lot of times with coming of age is that present tense feels right to a lot of writers because it helps them to embody that young protagonist, your young self. There's less of a sense of removal when you're a child or a young person and you're embodied in the present tense. And so you often will see that coming of age narratives will choose present tense, but certainly not exclusively. Now, just because this is Google search inside the book, they skip some pages, but I want to go down to part 2, because you'll see that what he does is he picks up in past tense. In a week, we arrived at Moville, County Donegal, where we took a bus to Belfast, and from there another bus. We left the trunk in the shop and set out to walk the 2 miles up the road to Grandpa McCourt's house. It was dark on the road, the dawn barely stirring on the hills beyond. Dad carried the twins in his arms, and they took him crying with the hunger. Ma'am stopped, right? So you can see, clearly here our tense is past tense. And so I think it's helpful to read, again, to read Angela's Ashes and look at tense and see how he's doing this. What Frank McCourt is never going to do is mid-scene all of a sudden switch his tense. This scene is all the way in past tense, and the previous scene was all the way in present tense. And so for you guys, some of you might be doing different narrative threads also. So let's say you have a braided narrative and you have an adult voice and a child voice. This is very commonly a place where people will choose different tenses. So the adult narrator, let's say the adult narrator is in her 40s, may be writing in the past tense. But then when that adult narrator flashes back into a child point of view, then she may choose a present tense child narrator. And again, that ought to be consistent. If you make that choice, that needs to be a consistent choice throughout the book, because it's also an indicator to your reader, oh, now we're in the child's point of view, because you have established the child's point of view as present. So these are choices. You could also do the reverse, by the way. Your adult narrator could be in the present and your child narrator could be in the past. One great exercise for tense is to write the same scene once in the past tense and once in the present tense, and then read them aloud and see how they feel. So again, you're not going to be wrong, whatever you do. It's really a stylistic choice. I wanted to just show a couple of other ones. Jennifer Lauck, this book is really a beautiful coming of age narrative, and the entire thing is in the present tense, and she's a child, young. I'm not remembering how old she is, but every morning I wish I was waking up in my pink bedroom in the house on Mary Street. When I open my eyes, BJ's bunk bed bottom is the first thing I see. And I know we're not in the house on Mary Street, nowhere near Carson City. We live in Hermosa Beach. Daddy says Hermosa means beautiful in Spanish. So it's a child, you feel the child narrator here, right? And it is quite astounding to carry an entire narration in the present tense. And yet, like I said, a lot of coming of age narratives are present because of that child visceral sensibility that you get in the present tense. I didn't totally intentionally choose only coming of age narratives here. It's just that a lot of coming of age narratives happen to be in present. But by contrast, I wanted to share Heavy, which is Kiese Laymon's beautiful book. And that whole thing is in the past tense, but he does this very interesting thing where he uses you, the second person, and he's talking to his mother, for those of you who have read that. So you is not the reader. It always is referring to his mother. And he sets that up in the beginning so that that's very clear what is happening so that you're not confused. But that's why this starts. You were on your way back from Hawaii with Malachi Hunter. And he's talking about his mom. But he says, while I sat in the middle of a white 8th grade classroom, filled with white folk we didn't even know. These white folk watched us toss black vocabulary words, a dull butter knife, and pink grapefruit slices back and forth until it was time for us to go home. So you see, he's consistently in the past tense here. And that's why I say it's not right or wrong. I think you really need to feel into what your own preference is and where your writing feels more poignant to you. And your age actually does matter to some extent. I say that because, like I said, there's this thing with coming of age narratives that I have seen authors over and over again be drawn to the present tense. And I do think that is about accessing that child in a way that is about embodying that voice, and it feels more true. Okay. The adult narrator, if you choose present tense for your adult narrator, you are going to run into some complications around reflection. It's difficult to reflect in the present tense because you're not giving yourself much space to basically have room for like what reflection evokes. Reflection is this opportunity to say to the reader, this is why this mattered. This is what sense I made of it. It's that sort of excavating around in the experience. And that is rarely done in the present tense. Now, some people do a lot of deep showing, through the present tense in a way that almost has the impact of feeling reflective because there are takeaways in that. But if you are a person who, your writing tends to be a little bit more process oriented, or you're wanting to make sense of your experience, I think you'll find that you will have to write in the past tense. Now, to be clear, you can do both, like Frank McCourt. And I personally am experimenting with both in my own narrative, and I'm really, really liking that. There's also the second person, which Carmen Maria Machado does so beautifully, right? Where she's saying you this and you that, but the you is actually her, so she says, you wake up in the morning and you put on makeup and you do this. Now that's also a really interesting way to experiment. And so if you're thinking about doing your book in a little bit more of a fragmented way that maybe has different kinds of narrative threads, you could try all of them. It's just that each of your vignettes or each of your scenes, however you want to think about them, they're self-contained, right? So those self-contained bubbles need to just have a particular orientation and choice. And so if the choice is present tense, for a particular vignette, stick with that and don't just, veer off mid vignette. And that way you can play with and have multiple choices. So I'm all about freedom, and that's one thing that when we teach our long classes, Linda Joy and I both want to be very permission giving, but we also want to make sure that you don't go off the rails because it is a really distressing reading experience when a person has zero control of their tenses and you're like, oh my God, like within a single narrative, it's like present, past, present, past. That doesn't feel good. It gets disorienting and we don't know where we're anchored. So this stuff really does matter.